Kazukan Kazakita! Dwarfs are awesome. But if you are a nerd with some degree of obsession about realism in fantasy, like me, then you have some questions that Dwarven lore just cannot answer. And so, I invite you to nerd out with me for a few moments, overthinking our favorite Dawi from Warhammer Fantasy. By the way, hi, I am Not-a-witchr, and as you can see, my prayers to the ancestors have finally been answered, and now I have a semblance of a dwarven beard. In this video I will try to answer some of the questions that nobody except me is asking, like why dwarven weapons have such thick shapes? Why do some dwarfs have horns on their helmets? Why dwarfs do not hide their beards under their armor in battle? And also I will uncover some difficulties that slayers face when dyeing their hair. Let us get wiser together. An iconic weapon of an old-school dwarf, a battle axe. Another canonic weapon that I don't have on me right now, a warhammer. Aren't they great? But there are many history nerds who dare to claim that the shape and size of these weapons are not realistic. Is there any truth to that, or is it a misconception born from ignorance of Dawi culture? First, axes. The argument goes like this. Axes have slashing type of damage. But how can something like this effectively chop through anything when the blade is so wide and thick? And why have so much bulk when it only increases the weight and prevents effective cutting? All the examples of historical battle axes have quite small and narrow blades, including Viking weapons. The similar arguments are usually used when complaining about fantasy hammers. Real warhammers had small hitting heads, which allowed to focus the force applied on a small area and break through armor. And breaking armor was their main purpose on the battlefield. This is, by the way, why maces and morning stars have their pointy or protruding bits, and not just a smooth surface. Following this logic, big square hammers with big flat hitting sides would have a hard time breaking through armor or shields. Does this mean that all dwarven melee weapons in Warhammer are wrong and useless, and are you ready to repeat this before a squad of slayers? So why is that with the weapon shapes? Well, we could remember that early Warhammer miniatures was made from plastic to be sturdy, visually expressive and distinguishable, and not for realism. And later, video games tried to recreate these canonic images with respect to the original shapes. But that is not what I think. And some of you may already know where I'm going with this, but hear me out. From one hand, we have human-made axes that have narrow blades to work with wood by slicing it, like this hatchet. But there are axes whose primary purpose is splitting the firewood, and they have a special form with much wider sides to apply force differently. Not to cut, but to split. Some of them are even designed to work with a hammer to split whole logs of wood. So something like this axe would be much better suited for this kind of work than for slicing meat or shaving. And this is only a half of my argument. Another half is about the hammers. And do not put me in the book too soon, let me finish. This hammer, these hammers look less like warhammers but more like sledgehammers, railroad hammers, blacksmith's hammers, crafting tools. This makes perfect sense. The cornerstone of Dawi society is not war, but craft. All the tools that dwarfs have developed, they developed originally not for killing their enemies, but as they live in the world of Warhammer Fantasy, they had to adapt. And so their tools became also the weapons of war. And with some time, some of those tools, even while being used exclusively for war, still bear shapes and some functions of the crafting tools of Dawi ancestors. at minimum as a deeply rooted tradition. I like to imagine that every hammerer became an elite fighter only after many years of building railroads for the mining carts using similar hammers, and in times of peace they still remember their craft. What's interesting, these shapes of the dwarven weapons might make them better suited for different application in warfare than expected. Like, take this axe of Bardin Gorikson from Vermintide. It is notably an armor-piercing weapon, a function with which some other axe that would have much thinner and sharper blade might struggle with. It is specifically well suited for denting enemy armor and splitting enemy shields, and not for, let's say, applying bleeding damage. Another Vermintide example, Bardin's Warhammers, which are not that much armor-piercing because they are intended for cleaving through the hordes of lighter enemies, breaking their bones and simply getting them out of the way. Somebody clearly put a lot of thought in this. This is one of the things in which Vermintide is superior to Total War Warhammer, where the similar axes deal regular damage and big hammers deal armor-piercing damage. So, in short, this kind of weapon can be realistic for Dwarven culture, even if some people think that it looks oversized and cartoonish. It's been some time already since historians on the internet started getting annoyed by the overuse of horned helmets in portrayals of Vikings. And since dwarfs traditionally have many Nordic features, it is only a matter of time when somebody will start shaming dwarfs for using a wrong stereotype. Let them try. But, thinking about Warhammer dwarfs, I actually came out to the conclusion that there is some discrepancy here. You see, Dawi are not widely known as cow herders, and they actually don't have a lot of pasture grounds suitable for raising such big cattle. Even if we think about highland miniature cows, it would not work for dwarves. Goats? Yes. Goats are known to thrive in rocky places, and they are traditionally associated with dwarfs in fantasy. But not cows. Then why so many dwarf warriors have their helmets decorated with what clearly looks like bovine horns? The dwarfs, of course, could be trading those horns from humans or even halflings, but why? The horns on the helmet do not provide any additional protection. They don't make the wearer look any taller. Shoot! They're not used to signify a rank of an officer, and in worst-case scenario, they would even make a dwarf's head easier a target for melee attacks. So, am I saying that dwarfs should get rid of them? Well, there is one explanation that I'm leaning towards, and it describes both where the Dawi got those horns and why they keep adorning their helmets in such a manner. The Dawi society value honor above all, and these could be trophies taken from slain enemies to boast and brag. For example, some of the orc boys wear horned helmets, probably to make them look scarier, considering the quality of their craftsmanship. And the black orcs, the elite of the green-skin armies, have some seriously looking helmets. Of course, not a one dwarf would ever think of wearing something that was taken from a head of a filthy greenskin, but to take the horns from the helmet of a slain enemy as a proof of one's battle prowess, that, I think, is quite reasonable. I wonder if orcs also have such a custom. Could it be that some of those horns switch sides several times in their lifetime? Another idea, the horns of beastmen, especially minotaurs. To display such a trophy on a helmet could invoke respect and envy from many a dwarf. Of course, it would be only tips of horns to fit on a dwarven helmet. But wait, shouldn't we be wary of chaos corruption from anything that relates to the beastmen? Well, that might be seen as just a superstition, or be a sign of strength of those dwarves who do not fear chaos-related things near their head. You know, like not wearing protective gear when working with dangerous materials. So, with all that said, I think that horns on a helmet can be considered a canon part of Dawi culture in some cases. Now, talking about a sensitive matter like beards is always a tricky business. It is a vessel of one's honor, after all. But we must ask hard questions if we are to obtain wisdom. So, I ask you this. If the length and girth of a beard is an indicator of social status and is of great importance to every Dawi, then why it is not especially protected in battle? Wouldn't it be wiser to put the treasured hair under the chainmail shirt that any dwarf warrior wears to war? You know, to preserve one's honor from being cut off by an unfortunate swing of the enemy's blade. I mean, we protect other important parts that are somewhat smaller. I know, in the book I go, just for discussing such matters. But it is a matter more complicated than it would seem. First, let us consider that beard hair is not that easy to chop off, even human beard hair, and we all know that Dawi have much thicker and sturdier beard hair than Umgi. The hairs of the beard bend and move individually when they meet hard objects, and even braided beard hair have a lot of flexibility. If you've ever trimmed your beard, to give it a specific shape of course, I wouldn't even imply anything dishonorable, then you know that it can be tricky if you can't fixate both ends of the hairs you try to cut. Otherwise, your shears would cut only some of the hairs before the rest shifts away from the blade. And with something like a knife, you can only cut hair by sawing it off with several repeated movements. So, as you can imagine, in combat, it is very hard to strike a dwarf's beard in a way that the blade would apply force so accurately to chop off even a part of it. It could even have the opposite effect. The beard would increase the protection granted by the armor and somewhat soften the blow before it even reaches the armor, because beard hair has some resistance and volume as well as flexibility. And of course, let us not forget that dwarven beards are actually protected in battle by shields, sometimes even by a specialized part of the helmet, even if partially. As you can see, it is not that easy to separate the vessel of honor from a Dawi. Which leads us to my next question. Slayers are the most recognizable Dawi warriors, mostly because of the same procedure that every dishonored dwarf must undergo in order to reclaim their lost honor. They make a pilgrimage to the holy shrine of Grimnir, where they ritually shave their heads except for the crest, and then they dye their hair and beards bright orange-red, and also they use animal fat to shape their remaining hair into high mohawks that make them seen from afar by the enemies in battle. You probably know all of this. But have you ever thought that we never see slayers with the roots of their hair growing in their original color? Of course, you may argue that most slayers do not survive their first battle, because it actually is the intentional way to restore their honor, and not many dwarfs are used to fight without any armor. But at the same time, there is the conception of the bigger the crest, the longer the slayer survived, which indicates the most capable and successful warriors among them. And so it would either mean that these slayers would have their hair roots grow out in their original color, as well as their beards, or that they have to periodically dye their roots again. And if the secret of the orange dye is closely guarded by the Slayer cult, does it mean that they have to periodically make another pilgrimage to Karak Kadrin? Lucky are those Slayers whose hair was red from the beginning. Well, maybe not as lucky as those who didn't lose their honor. Or maybe red-haired dwarfs are somehow naturally more prone to dishonorable behavior? Well, the answer should lie in the longevity of the dwarfs. It is much longer than human lifespan, and it might mean that the rate with which their hair grows is much slower, so they don't have to worry as much about their roots showing. They have enough to worry about. There is one funny thing that you may notice if you're somewhat familiar with hair dyeing. The final color depends less on the pigment that you use for it, and more on the natural color of your hair. The darker your hair is, the darker will the final color be. If a Dawi has lighter hair, it will be no problem to add the red pigment to achieve the desired orange. But if a Dawi has, let's say, dark brown or black natural hair, then he has first to bleach his hair and wait before applying the red pigment. And that means that some of Slayers, at one point in their lives, were bleached blondies. Personally, I find it kinda funny. Now you can add me in the book again. Well, that was some attempts to explain matters that usually do not need any explanation. But if for some reason you found it interesting or entertaining, thank you for watching. Consider subscribing to my channel if you like videos like this. I'm still Not-a-witchr, and as always, take care and farewell.